Good day. Today is Tuesday, 18th February 2025, and I think that it is now increasingly clear that we are indeed in the end game in terms of the Ukraine conflict, and that the end game in the Ukrainian conflict, the end of the Ukrainian conflict, is also going to result in a significant rearrangement of the geopolitical pieces around the world. It's not entirely clear how far and extensive that rearrangement is going to be, but I think it's fair to say that the United States, Russia and China are indisputably emerging as the great powers. Europe, which has been the core continent in global affairs since the 15th century and which dominated international affairs in the 20th century, is now definitely in eclipse. I would quickly and briefly say that I believe that the Russian-Chinese strategic partnership will continue unchanged. I know there's been some discussion about this, including on the threads. Some people are saying that the Russians might be minded to tilt back towards the Americans, or that they would be foolish if they did so. In my opinion, the Russians, if they're asked any questions about their strategic partnership with China by the Americans, will simply say that it is non-negotiable and will be continued. And about that, I have absolutely no doubt at all. But anyway, let's focus on the events of the last 24 hours, which continue to be dramatic. Now, in my experience, when angry and hysterical people meet, and I've been in meetings, many meetings when that has happened, even when those angry and hysterical people all pretend that they are in agreement with each other, they end up being angry and hysterical against each other. It all explodes into rows and tantrums and theatrical performances, and that is exactly what we saw at the summit meeting, the crisis summit meeting, which Emmanuel Macron convened in Paris. What was intended to be a show of unity, a European show of unity and a show of European resolve, ended up being no such thing. Now, this is despite the fact that, as was not clear to me before, this was not a meeting of the European Union. It was not a NATO meeting or anything like that, because the list of invitees was very, very carefully selected. Macron made sure that what the EU leadership sees as the awkward squad, people like Viktor Orban of Hungary, Robert Fico of Slovakia, a number of other leaders, President of Croatia apparently, that they did not get invitations. In other words, this is supposed to be a meeting of those leaders, those European leaders who were united in hostility to Russia, who were united in the belief that, or at least in the pretense, that Russia poses some kind of existential threat to Europe, who are united in their anger and criticism of Donald Trump and his administration in the United States, and who are collectively furious about the fact that Europe is not participating in the ongoing negotiations between the Americans and the Russians, of which we've had the first session in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia, about which I will say more shortly. So this was supposed to be a meeting of friends, of people who agree with each other. And it's absolutely clear to me that Macron and Starmer, who have formed the odd, or if you prefer, terrible couple in European politics over the last couple of weeks, basically since Starmer was elected. Why Starmer, by the way, who's only recently been elected, should choose to attach himself to the sinking figure of Emmanuel Macron is a good question. It begs further questions about Prime Minister Starmer's political judgment, but never mind. Anyway, it's clear to me that Macron and Starmer were working together and had planned it all in advance, and that what they were intending to do at the Paris summit, which, as I said, was not an EU meeting. So even though Ursula von der Leyen was there, Keir Starmer was also there, and of course he leads a country which, properly speaking, is not part of the EU, though under Starmer it is increasingly aligning itself with the EU on many matters. But anyway, that's a discussion for another day. Anyway, Starmer and Macron planned it all together, and the idea clearly was to bounce the other European states not only into taking a strong line against the negotiations underway between the Americans and the Russians. If they had limited themselves to that, they might even have got a strong statement from the summit meeting, which would at least have presented a show of unity. Anyway, the intention was to get a European force, to cobble together a European force to send to Ukraine after the peace agreement had supposedly been reached. Now, the Europeans, Macron and Starmer, these two European leaders, know and must have known for a long time that the Russians have repeatedly and clearly spoken out against the possibility of such a force being deployed to Ukraine. Now, yesterday, Peskov and other Russian officials spoke about it negatively. Today, the Russians have rejected it categorically. Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister, Alexander Grushko, has said in response to a question from TASS, a TASS question that was obviously prearranged. TASS is, after all, Russia's official news agency. He said, our reaction is negative, and we have said this many times, under whatever guise European troops appear there, this is a step towards escalation. And apparently he went on to say that Russia categorically opposes it. I've seen reports to this effect in the Russian media, though for some reason TASS is not reporting those additional words. So the Russians have always said, they made it completely clear as crystal, that they are not going to accept and agree to the deployment of a European peacekeeping force to Ukraine. They've said this many times. There's supposed to be a questionnaire floating around European capitals, produced apparently by Keith Kellogg, asking the Europeans what they would be able to contribute and what they would be able to do. I will come to that shortly. But the Russians have consistently said that they are completely opposed to the deployment of a peacekeeping force in Ukraine. So I think the idea of refloating this idea of a peacekeeping force had two purposes. One was to provide a show of force, to show to the Americans and to the Russians that Europe really does have significant armed forces, that it can put on a show of force, that it can commit troops to Ukraine if needed, and that Europe, therefore, cannot be ignored or disregarded in the negotiations because it is collectively a significant power precisely on the European continent. So I think that was one purpose. The other, straightforwardly, was to wreck the negotiations. The Europeans are making a proposal a deployment of a European peacekeeping force to Ukraine, which they know the Russians will never accept, and they hope that by doing that, they will put a spoke in the negotiations and prevent the negotiations reaching any kind of positive conclusion. Well, that was the plan. It's always an overcomplicated plan. Macron's plans are always overcomplicated. I don't think Keir Starmer has the intellect to come up with a plan of this kind. But of course, whenever there's a possibility for him to take a confrontational line towards the Russians especially, he jumps at it. He supports Ukraine's irreversible course towards NATO, for example. He likes to pose as the leader of a powerful country, making a strong military statement. All of those things. And, he likes to pretend, as so many British leaders like to pretend that he's Winston Churchill and it's 1938 all over again, and he and the British are standing firm against appeasement always being whatever it is that the British say it is at any particular point in time, whenever negotiations with another party, an adversary, shape up. Anyway, this is, I think, Starmer's motivation. Macron's motivation was, as I said, to wreck the negotiations and to put on a show of force. And it blew up in their faces because the other European states were not keen. The Germans were absolutely furious. Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, left the meeting early. He issued a excoriating statement saying that he thought it was irresponsible and inappropriate and premature to talk about peacekeeping forces when negotiations to settle the conflict have not even started, and when Ukraine itself has not even been properly consulted about this idea, and when nobody knows what the outcome of the negotiations can possibly be. And Scholz said that he was personally offended that this proposal had even been floated at all. Now, there are some people in Germany who probably would support this proposal. Annalena Baerbock and Robert Habeck of the Greens. For example, the Greens, over the last 30 years, have completed a metamorphosis from Germany's peace party to Germany's extreme war party. And they, of course, are very, very keen on doing anything that will not only prolong the war, a war that they have become massive and fervid advocates of, but which could escalate the already dangerous crisis with Russia. So Baerbock and Habeck probably would support this proposal. But I suspect that right across the rest of the German political spectrum, including apparently Friedrich Merz and the CDU, there is deep skepticism and hostility to this idea. The idea of sending German troops to Ukraine, potentially to confront the Russians, is not one that Germans favour. And I think on this issue, specific issue, there is little actual difference between Scholz and Merz, and one should not expect any sudden shift in policy if, as is overwhelmingly likely, Friedrich Merz becomes the new Chancellor of Germany in a few weeks' time after the German elections, which are due to take place on Sunday. So, the Germans, very unhappy. Other European states, unhappy as well. They all came and said, what do the Americans think about this? What is their stance? Would they support this? Would they oppose this? And, of course, the answer is that the Americans have already made clear. Pete Hegseth, in his speech to the Ramstein meeting about a week ago, said that if peacekeeping forces are deployed to Ukraine, and he used the word if, as I pointed out in my own program yesterday. So he doesn't necessarily expect peacekeeping forces to be sent to Ukraine, just saying. But Hegseth said if peacekeeping forces are sent to Ukraine, they will not be covered by NATO's Article 5 guarantee. And if the United States is not prepared to extend an Article 5 guarantee to these peacekeeping forces, we can take it that they would not extend any other type of guarantee to these peacekeeping forces. And in fact, American officials privately have apparently been making that crystal clear. So there is no prospect of the Americans providing such a guarantee. But of course, Keir Starmer has got into the habit, where the Americans are concerned, of not taking no for an answer. He's gone to a huge amount of trouble putting forward the proposal to send peacekeeping forces to Ukraine, including British ones. So he makes comments immediately after the breakup of the Paris meeting, which is what basically happened. He made comments to the effect that the Americans must provide a backstop. They need to provide some commitment to the peacekeeping forces, because otherwise this thing can't run, and somehow the Americans supposedly have some kind of obligation to see it done. Even though, as I said, the Americans have already rejected it. He even refloated the idea of the Americans providing air cover. In other words, the Americans being prepared to confront the Russians on a military basis. There is no possibility that this will happen. The Russians have already categorically rejected this idea, as I have said, and the Americans have rejected the idea of providing security guarantees to Ukraine, and security guarantees for any European troops that go to Ukraine. So, at this meeting in Paris, this fantasy was exposed, and reading between the lines, there was clearly a row, and perhaps more than one row. And ultimately, it turned out that all that the British and the French could come up with was a force of 25 to 30,000 men, far short of the 100, 140, 200,000 men that various people have been talking about. 25 to 30,000 men. And the Ukrainians have already made clear that as far as they are concerned, that is not enough. Now, the best comment about this ludicrous affair, has been provided by Anatol Lieven in an article he has done on responsible statecraft. And he's put it very well. He said Paris summit was theatre and much ado about nothing. I think that's actually far too generous, actually. I don't think it was just much ado about nothing. I think it was, as I said, hysteria on public display. But then he goes on to say Europeans are arguing for commitments that they cannot keep, and Russia is bound to test, but not all agree anyway, which is absolutely true. So this is how Anatol Lieven puts it. Macron presumably hoped that the leaders of the other major European states would rally behind his own proposal of French and European peacekeeping troops for Ukraine, an idea already categorically rejected by Moscow. Keir Starmer of the United Kingdom did, and here I would add, of course, make such an offer. only shortly afterwards to say that no European guarantee of Ukrainian security would be credible without what he called a US backstop. Since Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has already publicly ruled out any such US guarantee, Starmer thereby implicitly admitted, again, I think this is too generous to Starmer actually, Starmer thereby implicitly admitted that his offer of British troops was empty. What it really means is that Starmer has been exposed again as a fool. He made a proposal expecting, along with Macron, that the various European states would unite to support it, that large forces would be committed, and then Starmer and Macron imagined that they would then be able to come to the Americans and say, look, we're prepared to put tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of troops in Ukraine. Given that that is so, you really must come forward and give us this support that we need in order to make this happen. And of course, it didn't happen. Anybody who has been looking at the situation in Europe, anybody who knows the feelings of the European public about this issue would know that they do not want their troops to be placed in line of fire against the terrifying Russian army. They do not want a war with Russia. And most European governments were simply going to balk at this idea. And then Anatol Lieven, going back to him, says that British parliamentarians have also demanded a vote on the dispatch of British troops, which, by the way, which is true, and is, by the way, the first sign that some people in London are beginning to have misgivings and concerns about this, not before time, I might add, but for what it is worth, I would say that this is a step in the right direction, though no one should be in any doubt that with the present makeup of the British Parliament, a vote to send troops to Ukraine would probably be overwhelmingly supported, despite the inevitable disastrous consequences that would flow from it. Anyway, that's going back to Anatol Lieven. In the meantime, on leaving the Paris meeting, Chancellor Scholz of Germany said that a discussion of European troops for Ukraine is completely premature and highly inappropriate while the war is ongoing. Prime Minister Donald Tusk of Poland, one of Ukraine's strongest supporters, ruled out Polish troops altogether. We do not plan to send Polish soldiers to the territory of Ukraine. We will give logistical and political support to the countries that will possibly want to provide such guarantees in the future, such physical guarantees. And then, as far as I can see, the summit meeting broke up without even a statement. At least if there was a statement, I can't find it. Maybe there was a statement, and maybe somebody can provide it to me. But it's clear that there was no substantive agreement about anything. This was a display not of strength and unity, but of division and weakness. Now, when we come to the topic of weakness, it's important to understand how weak the hand the Europeans are playing from actually is. Now, I understand that before he came to Paris, Chancellor Scholz had received a report from the German military informing him that the German military today is in an even worse state than it was before the special military operation began. Many of its best weapons have been transferred to Ukraine. German military production has increased somewhat, but nowhere near enough to make up for the constant transfers of equipment that have been taking place to Ukraine. So the German army is simply not in a position to put in a strong showing if it is deployed to Ukraine, something which, by the way, German public opinion strongly opposes. Now, I am not able to discuss the situation in France. My sense is that the military in France is in somewhat better shape, slightly better shape than some of the other European militaries are. But if we're talking about the British military, the situation there is absolutely terrible. And here we've had a discussion about the state of the British military by our old friend Dr. Jack Watling of the Royal United Services Institute. He's discussed the state of the British military in another article for the Daily Telegraph. He says that the state of the British Armoured Division, the only division in the British military that has supposedly tanks and armoured vehicles, is absolutely dire, and that it's not really in a position to engage in war fighting in any significant way. And he puts it like this. He says that Britain's 3rd Division, this is its armoured division, are better trained than the Ukrainian troops who conducted the 2023 summer offensive against the Russians, but who failed disastrously. He says they're better trained. That might be true. But they are worse equipped than the Ukrainians were. Ukraine had 57 Leopard 2 tanks, 14 Challenger 2s, Vincent 1 breaching vehicles, Bradley and Marder infantry fighting vehicles, a large number of upgraded Soviet-designed tanks, and some 55 howitzers in the forces committed to attack Tokmak. This is the town that the Ukrainians needed to capture at the first stage of their summer 2023 counteroffensive if they were to break through and reach the Black Sea. The Black Sea. Of course, they didn't capture Tokmak. In fact, they never reached it. And Jack Watling then goes on to say, 3rd Division, that's the armoured division, by contrast, will have no infantry fighting vehicles, currently fields 14 artillery pieces, lacks the spares to support its tank fleet. In theory, the division will eventually field 2 regiments of Challenger 3 main battle tanks. Of course, the Challenger 3 doesn't actually exist. Just to say, this is the development of the Challenger 2, which is supposed to be produced in the future for the British Army. Brian Paletic has already pointed out that when it does appear, it will be nothing more than a souped-up Challenger 2. But for the moment, at least, it doesn't actually even exist. I have read several reports in the past that says that the total functioning stockpile, inventory of Challenger 2s, Britain's actual main battle tank at the moment, numbers around 40. So anyway, in theory, the division will eventually field 2 regiments of, brackets, non-existent Challenger 3 main battle tanks, but it does not have the logistics or engineering equipment to support them. It does have a large fleet of M270 multiple launch rocket systems. This is the tracked vehicle that launches multiple launch rocket systems that are, in all other respects, identical to the HIMARS. But Britain likely has fewer munitions for them than Ukraine received to support its 2023 counteroffensive, which was insufficient. The very notion that the British division really has 3 brigade combat teams is hard to support. The division consists of 3 brigades. Perhaps 1 brigade could be cobbled together out of what remains, but the other 2 are ghosts. And he goes on to say one of them is a deep reconnaissance strike brigade without any main battle tanks or even infantry. And then he goes on to say the British Army's hollowness goes much further. However, the battlefield in Ukraine has demonstrated that electronic warfare equipment is essential for all units, as is the ability to defeat drones. Units also need much more reconnaissance equipment, especially drones, to find and strike targets beyond line of sight. Air defence has also proved critical to protecting the force from glide bombs and ballistic missiles. 3rd Division lacks any of this equipment at scale and has insufficient number of personnel trained to operate it. Of course, it's important to say that if we're talking about drones, the Russians not only have a colossal advantage now in terms of drone warfare over all NATO armies, including the Americans, but they have thousands of trained and experienced drone operators who have operated drones in combat conditions, something which no NATO army, and so certainly not the British Army, can do. And he goes on to say, this is Jack Watling, while British soldiers are well trained today, the quality of training is being threatened due to a lack of availability of training areas and a shortage of equipment to train with. So, is this the force that you want to send to Ukraine to stand off against the Russians? It is not just ridiculous, it is criminal. The only conceivable circumstance in which they could be sent is not, put aside the question of American guarantees. The Americans are never going to give guarantees. The only conceivable way it could happen is if the Russians agree. Because if the Russians don't agree, these troops, if they were deployed to Ukraine, would be doomed. The Russians, it would take them a few weeks, no doubt, but the Russians would destroy this expeditionary force in short order. Just saying. So, the Russians have said that they don't agree, and they will never agree. So why even discuss this thing? As I said, I don't know what the state of the French army is. Perhaps it's a bit better. I sometimes get the sense that it is. I've heard that the Leclerc tank is a rather sophisticated and worthy piece of equipment. I'm sure that it is. But again, however strong the French army in practical terms is it really competent to carry out an operation where it stands off against the Russians? The Russians know this. The Americans know this. The French and the British are putting on a show that is without meaning. And this whole idea, when it was put to the test at this summit meeting in Paris, obviously and immediately fell apart. Now, Anatole Lieven says that it's all much ado about nothing, taking the line from the title of one of Shakespeare's plays. I would use a rather stronger sentence, also of Shakespeare's, from Macbeth. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Well, there we are. The British, the French, the Europeans all together, they put on a show, they meet in Paris, they promptly quarrel and argue with each other, they cannot agree on anything. Starmer talks about sending a force that doesn't exist. in practical terms to Ukraine. The Russians say categorically no. The French say they're for. Everyone else says you must be joking. The whole thing just disintegrates from that moment on. Now the Russians are saying that there is no sense, that there is no logic in involving the Europeans in any negotiations concerning Ukraine. They're saying, why should the Europeans be involved in negotiations? These people do not want peace. They want to prolong the war. Do you want warmongers involved in peace negotiations? Do you want warmongers participating in peace negotiations when their only objective is to wreck the peace negotiations? And the Russians, I would suggest, on this, are obviously correct. The Americans, by the way, Marco Rubio, are saying that of course, the Europeans will one day be involved and they will be consulted. They will doubtless be consulted only once this whole ghastly business has been resolved, because involving them at any earlier point is absurd. They have nothing to bring to the table. They have no constructive ideas to propose. They criticise and wail from the sidelines, and that is all. Anyway, someone else tried to gate crash the discussions in Saudi Arabia, and I've already talked about that in my previous video, and that of course was none other than the Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, who turned up in the UAE, where, by the way, he signed a partnership agreement with the UAE. Now, this has been discussed and analysed by various people, and the point that several of them have made, and I'm not going to push back on it, is that this partnership agreement appears to be mostly about ending restrictions on financial transfers from Ukraine to the UAE. It very much looks, in other words, like a mechanism to allow the Ukrainian elite, which must now see that the writing is on the wall, to allow the Ukrainian elite to take out whatever money they still have in Ukraine as quickly as possible and to transfer them to the banks in Dubai. Now, as I said, this isn't my analysis. I've not studied this agreement. It's analysis that I've seen others make, but I think it's highly likely to be true. But that wasn't the reason why Zelensky went to the UAE. Well, it might have been part of the reason, but the main reason surely was a last desperate attempt, a final throw by him to get involved in the negotiations, to participate in them. And of course the Russians and the Americans met yesterday. They've been meeting today, they've been meeting today. Zelensky wanted to come today. He wanted to turn up the palace. He's done this before. He wanted to participate in the talks, but the Saudis told him no. They said, you're welcome to visit our country. You're an honoured guest, but we're very preoccupied. The Crown Prince is busy. The Foreign Minister is busy as well. We can't host you. You can't come today. You must come tomorrow. You must come on the 19th of February. So Zelensky's people put out a story that really he was coming to Saudi. He'd been intending to come to Saudi Arabia. It was going to be a long-standing trip that he was planning to make. Again, if you really believe that, as I think I said in my program yesterday, I have a bridge to sell you. Well, today, when it became clear that he couldn't actually come to Saudi Arabia today, he couldn't join the talks, he flounced off. He's not going to go to Saudi Arabia at all. We have just received the report. Vladimir Zelensky has postponed his trip to Saudi Arabia after it hosted talks between Russia and the United States about ending the war in Ukraine. The Ukrainian president criticized the US-Russia meeting, saying talks are taking place about Ukraine again and without Ukraine. And we're told that Mr. Zelensky had been due to visit Saudi Arabia on Wednesday, but his trip has been delayed until March. We are honest and we are open for peace talks, but I've taken the decision of not visiting Saudi Arabia as I don't want to create a false image. So he's not going to Saudi Arabia after all. He is, by the way, insulting the Saudis, who, like Arabs generally, in my experience, take the rules of hospitality extremely seriously. They had said that he was welcome to visit their country tomorrow, but he's basically saying to the Saudis, well, if I can't visit your country to meet with the Americans and the Russians, I'm not going to bother to come at all. Or at least if I do come, I'll come a few weeks later in March, because ultimately you're not so important to me. I'm not going to waste time with you, not now, because I need to speak to the Americans and the Russians. The Saudis are an extremely polite people in terms of their conduct of international relations. They use extremely measured language in their public statements. They will be inwardly furious at this behavior of Zelensky's, which I have to say is not untypical. But anyway, Zelensky is furious about the fact that negotiations are taking place without Ukraine. The Biden administration ceaselessly, endlessly harped on about the fact that there would be no talks about Ukraine without Ukraine. That was one of the cliches that they ceaselessly churned out. I always thought it was utterly ridiculous. It seemed to me ludicrous that the United States and Russia, in the middle of an enormous global crisis, would not be able to speak with each other unless Zelensky, of all people, allowed them to. I mean, utterly preposterous. I would point out, by the way, that in the 1960s, during the Vietnam War, when the Americans were fighting the North Vietnamese and the Russians were arming the North Vietnamese, the Americans and the Russians spoke to each other regularly. They had a very successful summit meeting in the New England town of Glassboro in 1967, when the US President Lyndon Johnson met with the Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin. Glassboro kicked off the whole process of détente, and despite the Vietnam War, relations between the Soviet Union and the United States during that period actually gradually improved. Well, the Biden people, the Blinken people all of them took the opposite course. They refused to speak to the Russians, and thank heavens, Donald Trump and his people have put a stop to all the nonsense. But Zelensky, who is coming up with no proposals, he's coming up with no ideas, he's coming up with no suggestions about what can be done. He continues to talk about guarantees. He's issued more speeches recently saying that Ukraine needs to have vast armies, it needs to be supplied with huge numbers of missiles, because only those sort of missiles can deter the Russians. Anyway, Zelensky is furious about it because he's not been invited to talks, which, again, like the Europeans, if he ever participated in, he would work to wreck. Now, there has been an absolutely brilliant article, one of the best articles, in my opinion, written by anybody over the entire period of the Ukrainian conflict. An absolutely brilliant article by the former British diplomat Ian Proud which you can find on his Substack blog, Ian's Substack. And its title is History Made a Long Overdue Comeback on 12th February. And it's one of those articles with which I find myself not only in agreement, but which says it all so eloquently and so completely that in some respects it poses a challenge, because though the article is very measured and actually quite concise, it is quite long, and because it is very structured and tightly argued, separating stray sentences is really impossible, because you need to read the whole thing in order to get a full sense of its effect. But I mean, the most important point that he's making, the absolutely key point that he is making, is simply this: we're in the middle of a war, and there are no attempts, finally, to agree a peace. And instead of people being happy about that and supporting attempts to agree a peace, they want the war prolonged, and they're furious about the fact. I say people, I mean, of course, the European leaders and the Ukrainian leaders as well. They are furious that steps are being taken to end the war, even though it is a war that they are losing. And he does make some points. He makes points about Zelensky. He says that for the Ukrainian cabal in Kiev, with its Western paymasters, is terrified about the consequences of peace. For Zelensky, peace means a loss of power and authority. No more journalists hanging on his every word. No more standing ovations at big events in the West. No more rents. No more beatings and bussification of press-gang citizens. A return to shaving and normal business attire. For Western leaders and journalists, it means a terrifying reckoning with failure to prevent war, failure to win, a catastrophic failure of will at the altar of willful conceit. The war in Ukraine has been a catastrophe for Europe, more devastating than anything that has happened since the Second World War. And yet, most mainstream political leaders are desperate for the war to continue. Well, he says much, much else, all exactly to the point, with sentiments of anger and mourning for all of those people who have died tragically and unnecessarily, which I also share. But there it is. So, what did the Americans and the Russians do in Riyadh? We've now had lots of information about the meeting in Riyadh. We've had statements from Marco Rubio, and we've had statements from Lavrov, and we've had statements from Ushakov, Putin's foreign policy aide, and the third member of the Russian negotiating team, Kirill Dementiev. He is Dmitriev. He is the head of Russia's investment fund, a businessman, in other words. He is the equivalent, if you like, of Steve Wojtkov, who is the businessman who is acting as Trump's representative. Now, before I discuss what the Americans and the Russians have said after the meeting in Riyadh, which lasted 4.5 hours, I would like to turn first to the comments that the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov made before he travelled to Riyadh. Now, he made these statements over the course of a press conference in Moscow following meetings that he had had with the Serb Foreign Minister, Marko Juric. after they had, as I said, detailed talks with each other. But most of the press conference was not devoted to the development of Russian-Serb relations or to the internal situation in Serbia, which, from what I can tell, appears to be stabilizing, with President Vučić still very much in control. Inevitably, most of the discussion was about Ukraine and about the negotiations which were about to take place in Riyadh. Now, Eve Smith, in a recent article which I've already discussed in Naked Capitalism, spoke about how the Russians, which is to say Putin, Lavrov, and other Russian officials, have recently taken to setting out in long form at every possible opportunity that they are given the long story of Western deceit and duplicity, as they see it, over the conflict in Ukraine. And this press conference was no different. Lavrov went through the whole story again. He discussed the agreement that was reached between President Yanukovych and his opponents, brokered by the European Union in February 2014, which was immediately violated by the Maidan opposition, leading to Yanukovych's overthrow, with the European states who had brokered the agreement and had acted as guarantors looking the other way and telling the Russians, well, no great business, that's just politics. Yeah, we signed this agreement today, but Yanukovych gets overthrown a few hours later, and the agreement is obviously broken, but, this isn't anything ultimately very much to worry about. So he talks about that. He talks about the two Minsk agreements that were both violated, the various ceasefire agreements that were violated. He talks about Western duplicity over the Minsk agreement, how Hollande and Merkel pretended that they supported the Minsk agreement of which they were guarantors, or told the Russians they were guarantors, even as they looked the other way, as the Ukrainians immediately set about violating and ignoring it. He points out that the Minsk agreement was confirmed through a vote of the UN Security Council, for which all of the Western powers, including Britain and France, and of course the United States, voted. But of course that is ignored. He discusses the long, tangled story of the negotiations that never went anywhere to get the Minsk agreement implemented. He talks also about the Istanbul agreement, the negotiations in February, March, April 2022, after the special military operation had been launched, how that agreement appeared to have been agreed, except that, again, with Western backing and encouragement, as soon as the agreement was initialed and as soon as the Russians pulled their troops from Kiev, the Ukrainians went back on it. They just pretended that the agreement did not exist, that it had never been initialed, that it had never been made. So he also goes into even more detail. He talks about the Nuland-Payat call, which took place in February 2014, when Victoria Nuland, then Assistant Secretary of State, and Jeffrey Payat, the US ambassador to Ukraine, were caught over an open line picking future members of the Ukrainian government after Yanukovych was set for overthrow. So Lavrov sets all that out in detail. He also discusses the artificial nature of Ukraine's boundaries, how when the Soviet Union was organized the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was created. Vast territories inhabited by Russians, with Russian cities, factories, ports, all of those things, as Lavrov describes them. How all of that was transferred to Ukraine. He said that in the context of the creation of the Soviet Union, this wasn't expected to matter, because at that time, Russians, Ukrainians considered themselves to be fraternal people, part of the Eastern Slav Russian world, and the idea that they would ever be divided from each other was one that no one took seriously. He goes on to say, again, that after the Maidan coup, political leaders and a political movement took power in Ukraine that went back on all of that. They became increasingly antagonistic to Russians and all aspects of Russian culture. They worked to abolish the canonical church, to ban the canonical Orthodox Church in Ukraine, to suppress the Russian language, to eliminate all outward expressions of Russian culture and history on what had been formerly Russian territory. And then, of course, he comes to the nub. After this long discussion, he comes to the nub and he says, given that that is so, how can you seriously expect us to agree to any kind of territorial concessions or compromises with the Ukrainians as part of any negotiation process? He says, basically, in other words, that the Russians are going to insist that the four regions, all of them, the entirety of them, which are now recognized as Russian, continue to be so. That the Russians are not prepared to make any territorial compromises or concessions at all. Now, that was said by Lavrov before he went to Riyadh, and subsequently, after he went to Riyadh, after the discussions took place in Riyadh, similar comments have been repeated by other Russian officials. I believe that the Russian delegation to the United Nations, led by ambassadors Nebenzia and Polyansky, have also made statements about how Russia will not make any territorial compromises, that they will not give up a millimeter of what they now consider to be Russian territory. So there is no sign on this issue, which I know many people expect the Russians to compromise about. It seems that the Russians are not in a mood to make any concessions about it at all. Nonetheless, despite Lavrov going to Riyadh in what looks like an uncompromising mood, the Russians and the Americans came out of the meeting in Riyadh, both of them saying that progress had been made. And what we learn is that they are indeed seeking full normalization of relations. Marco Rubio is saying that the Americans and the Russians have finally agreed, they've finally come to that agreement, which the Russians have been calling for ever since the last weeks of Barack Obama's presidency. That the Americans and the Russians have finally agreed that all the blocks and restrictions on the operation of their diplomatic staffs in their respective countries should be lifted. The embassies, the Russian embassy in Washington and the American embassy in Moscow, will finally be brought back up to strength, and ambassadors presumably, will be appointed to head them. That is a significant step towards normalization, and not one that should be underestimated. There's no word from the Americans so far about whether former Russian diplomatic property will be returned to the Russians. About that, we shall see. But the fact that the embassies are going to start working again is a sign that, as I said, normalization is going to take place. Now, it's clear that there has been no agreement of any kind on any substantive question about Ukraine. Lavrov said that the Russians had the opportunity to set out their case to the Americans. The Americans were given their opportunity to set out their case to the Russians. There was what you might call, what diplomats in the old days used to call, a full and frank exchange of views. That doesn't, I think, mean a row. I gather that the mood in the meeting was actually good and cooperative. But the Russians have set out their views. As I said, Lavrov undoubtedly will have repeated many of the points he made during the press conference with the Serb foreign minister. And Rubio will have no doubt said the same thing. And according to Lavrov, the Americans have a better understanding of the Russian position than they'd had previously. Lavrov and Ushakov, who's also been speaking, both said that the Russian position remains the one that was outlined by Putin at the meeting with the foreign ministry, the Russian foreign ministry, in June 2024, when Putin basically set out the terms for the settlement of the conflict in Ukraine, which I have referred to as Istanbul Plus. In other words, Ukraine outside NATO, a fully neutral country. Again, demilitarization, a sharp reduction in the size of the Ukrainian armed forces, lifting of all restrictions on the practice of the Russian language, the practice of the Orthodox religion, all of those things, as well as steps to eliminate the ideology of the 1930s and 40s in Ukraine, and full acceptance that the four regions, all of them, every millimeter of them, including, of course, the city of Zaporozhye, are now Russian. So the Russians have not, at this meeting in Riyadh, retreated from that position. There's been some stories, speculation, some claims on Fox News that the Americans proposed a sequence of first a ceasefire, then negotiations, and then a settlement. The ceasefire supposedly to happen on Easter Day, which, as it happens, is the same day, is on the same calendrical day this year, according to both the Orthodox and Western calendars. The Russians have already said that they're not interested in such a ceasefire. And I suspect that on this, Fox is working from old information rather than from what was actually discussed, the substance of what was discussed at Riyadh. But anyway, on the question of the Ukrainian settlement, the two key decisions that were taken appear to have been these. Firstly, the Americans and the Russians have agreed to set up working parties to study every aspect of the conflict with each other. The Lavrov says that the Russians are waiting to see who the American experts are going to be, and then they will set up their own. Working parties is an interesting sign. It suggests that the Americans are at last and indeed taking some of these Russian concerns seriously. So there's going to be working parties set up. And the second point is that apparently the Americans and the Russians both agreed that as part of any Ukrainian settlement process, there have to be elections in Ukraine. Now, this is very important because when the Russians talk about elections in Ukraine and when the Americans talk about elections in Ukraine, what they mean is that Zelensky has to go. That is the intended outcome of elections. And if I have to be frank, I think that the Russians not only want the elections to happen, but they are also grooming the person who they want to see take over when Zelensky steps down, so that, and who they expect to see emerge as the new leader of Ukraine after the elections. This will be the leader with whom the Russians finally sign the peace. And both the Americans and the Russians agreed that the peace is intended to be a long-term, sustainable one, in fact, a permanent one. Now, the leader who I think the Russians have in mind as the next leader of Ukraine is, of course, Viktor Medvedchuk, the former leader of Ukraine's opposition, a powerful and effective politician in Ukraine, one who was arrested by Zelensky directly after the start of the special military operation. He was kept in custody by the Ukrainians for several weeks, several months, for about a year actually. The Russians eventually managed to get him out and brought him to Russia as part of a prisoner exchange. And recently, Medvedchuk has been giving a large number of interviews to the Russian media, which I see as a Russian attempt to raise his profile. So I believe that, as I said, he's been groomed and prepared by the Russians as the next leader of Ukraine and as the leader who will sign the peace. Now, whether that's going to happen, how it happens, I am not sure. But I would not be surprised, and indeed I think this is quite likely where we're heading, is that pressure will eventually be put on Zelensky to step down. Zelensky will step down. At that point, some kind of provisional or transitional government will be created in Kiev. At that point, but not before, we might be looking at a ceasefire, just saying. Elections will then be held. Probably the head of this interim administration will be Medvedchuk, and the Russian hope and expectation is that Medvedchuk would then win, and he would then be the person who would sign the peace. Now, this is my speculation of how the Russians see the thing going forward, because the advantage of all of this from the Russians is that at the end of this process, they would have a Ukrainian president who they know and who they consider to be their friend. By the way, just for the record, Putin is godfather to one of Medvedchuk's children, just saying. So they would have a president who would be their friend, and whatever peace they signed with him would be a peace which would have a strong legal basis and which it would be all but impossible, even for the European states, to quarrel with. I am not sure that how the mechanics of this would work, and I'm not sure that this is possible, and there are many unanswered questions. What happens to the various Banderite groups and ultra-nationalists and all of those people in the meantime, and what steps would be taken if they tried to disrupt this process. But it's the kind of thing which I can imagine the Americans and the Russians agreeing to with each other, because it is a neat way of untangling the knot, just to say. Anyway, so that's I think, part of what this is about. And I'm going to suggest that one of the reasons why Zelensky walked away in a huff, wouldn't go to Saudi Arabia, went back presumably to Ukraine, is precisely because he's getting hints and words about the fact that this is the direction events are taking. Now, the other thing that came out of the various statements that the American and Russian officials made after the talks is that the Americans are indeed keen to get the sanctions lifted and to agree to re-establish a strong commercial relationship with Russia. Rubio talked about the enormous economic and commercial opportunities that Russia offers. He's right about that, by the way. A country that is able to achieve 4% growth, as it is currently doing, despite sanctions. And by the way, the central bank in Russia has just upgraded significantly its GDP growth expectations for 2025. Anyway, such a country with abundant resources ought logically to be an attractive trade partner and business destination for the Americans. Now, over the last couple of days, there's been, well, to be precise, in the Daily Telegraph, there's been an analysis of the draft agreement that the Americans presented to Zelensky when he met with Rubio and Vance at the Munich Security Conference, demanding basically the handing over of Ukraine's mineral wealth. And, well, the Daily Telegraph, to be precise, Ambrose Evans Pritchard, speaks about its terms. And he says that it goes far beyond just handing over Ukraine's mineral wealth. He says that the agreement covers the economic value associated with resources of Ukraine, including mineral resources, oil and gas resources, ports, other infrastructure as agreed. And this agreement shall be governed by New York law without regard to conflict of law principles. The United States will take 50% of recurring revenues received by Ukraine from extraction of resources and 50% of the financial value of all new licenses issued to third parties for the future monetization of resources. There will be a lien on such revenues in favor of the US. And that clause means pay us first and then feed your children, said one source close to the negotiations. The agreement states that for all future licenses, the United States will have a right of first refusal for the purpose of purchase of exportable minerals. Washington will have sovereign immunity and acquire near total control over most of Ukraine's commodity and resource economy. And the fund there will be a fund to manage all of this. The fund shall have the exclusive right to establish the method, selection criteria, terms and conditions of all future licenses and projects. And Ambrose Evans-Pritchard says that this is an incredible proposal. He said he likens it to Versailles, to the Versailles Treaty that was imposed on Germany in 1919 after the First World War. He says that Trump's demands would amount to a higher share of Ukrainian GDP than reparations imposed on Germany at the Versailles Treaty, later whittled down at the London Conference in 1921 and by the Dawes Plan in 1924. And he says that the deal that was proposed seems willing to let Russia off the hook entirely. And this is all apparently intended to repay the United States for the money that has been given to Ukraine over the last 3+ years. Now, Ambrose Evans-Pritchard says that this is predatory neo-imperialism. I don't think so. After all, as the Daily Telegraph acknowledges, it was the Ukrainians who first proposed to trade their mineral wealth to the Americans in return for extra weapons. What this is, and the Daily Telegraph, Ambrose Evans-Pritchard, makes the absolutely correct point, that in fact the Americans don't really need most of these minerals anyway. There are lithium deposits and rare earth deposits in abundance on their own territory. What the Americans are doing is that they're throwing it all back into Ukraine's face. They're telling the Ukrainians, look, this is the amount of money we've given you. We gave you $500 billion of aid. And if you really are serious about paying it back, this is what you have to do. You have to turn yourselves into an American economic colony, and one which will remain that indefinitely. The Americans don't seriously believe the Ukrainians will sign that. They're simply telling the Ukrainians in no uncertain terms, well, we've heard what you say about your resources, but even your resources are not going to be anywhere near enough to paying us all back. Whereas with the Russians, it is different. Because not only are the Russians blessed with far more resources than Ukraine has, but of course they have a big functioning economy that the Americans can profitably trade with. And, well, Steve Witkoff is a businessman, and Kirill Dementyev is a businessman also. And they're there to talk with each other about all of these things. And for the Russians, $500 billion, which would be crippling to the Ukrainians, as the Americans have just demonstrated, is for the Russians an easy trade, one that they could profit from themselves. So let me just now round up with two further things. There's been some reports in some parts of the internet that the Financial Times has said that the United States is planning to withdraw its troops from the Baltic states. The only place in the Financial Times I've found any reference to that is an opinion piece written by Gideon Rachman, a ferociously anti-Trump commentator in the Financial Times. I don't myself place any value on Gideon Rachman as a source for that sort of information. I've heard nothing from any American official that says or suggests that the Americans are thinking of withdrawing troops from the Baltic states at this time. Now, the other thing I wanted to say is that a couple of days ago, all sorts of articles appeared in the Wall Street Journal, in The Guardian, about how the Ukrainians had recaptured the village of Pishanye, close to Pokrovsk, and how the Russian offensive had run out of steam. This is a typical example. This is from an article in The Guardian. Ukrainian forces have recaptured a village on the front line in the country's east amid signs Russia's advance may be slowing down. On Sunday, Ukrainian forces took back the village of Pishanye, southwest of the city of Pokrovsk. Russian units have made rapid progress, but now apparently they've stalled. The Russian progress has stalled. Russian bloggers say Ukrainian drones dominate the skies and have been methodically destroying armored vehicles. Russian troops have to walk 10 kilometers on foot, with many not arriving alive, they say. This is fantasy stuff. There have been Ukrainian counterattacks in the area of Pokrovsk, close to Kotlino and Pishanye. I've talked about them in previous programs. There was a Ukrainian attempt to capture Pishanye. The overwhelming consensus now from all reporters, including Ukrainian ones, is that it was unsuccessful, and Pishanye is now firmly under Russian control. Far from the Russian offensive having stalled, it is accelerating. It is gaining momentum. The Russians have been pushing forward rapidly now, very rapidly, west of Velikaya Novosilka, against what appears to be weak opposition. The pocket, the area that the Ukrainians had been defending south of Kurakovo appears to have completely collapsed. There are reports that hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers have been taken prisoner there. I spoke some time ago about how the village of Andreevka, southwest of Kurakovo, fortified village, had been captured by the Russians. The Russians now apparently control most of another village nearby called Urakli, and there is apparently now confirmed film showing that the Russians are indeed in Constantinople, another village which forms part of this same fortified area. The Russians have continued to enlarge their bridgehead west of the Oskol River. They've captured the village of Yampolovka on the Zherebets River, moving south towards Yampol. Soon they will be in control of the entire line, eastern banks of the Oskol and Zherebets rivers, and will have established powerful bridgeheads on the west banks of both of those rivers. There are reports that Russian troops have achieved major advances north of Toretsk towards Konstantinovka, the city there, and they appear to be making significant progress now, clearing Chasov Yar, and they've captured several important villages to the south of Chasov Yar. And a few days ago, Group of Forces North confirmed that Sverdlikovo, this key village that lies just north of the main road, the main supply road between Sumy in Ukraine and Sudzha, the one small town in Kursk region that the Ukrainians control, that Sverdlikovo has now been fully captured by the Russians and is under full Russian control. And I understand that the Russian Defense Ministry has confirmed this. Over the last couple of days, in fact, we have seen a big increase in the tempo of Russian advances. We're not quite back to the speed of advance that we saw in the late summer as the Russians pushed towards Pokrovsk and Selidovo, and were capturing villages and territory at incredible speed. But the momentum is accelerating again, and we could very well find ourselves in that position. Some are suggesting that Ukraine actually, in military terms, might collapse well before the midsummer, which is the point when the Ukrainian intelligence chief, Kirill Budanov, said it would collapse, militarily would collapse. So we see that there is actually very little time. The Ukrainian army has been defeated and ground down, and as I said, far from stalling or slowing, the Russians are once again advancing, and advancing fast. I forgot to mention that if we go back to the situation around Pokrovsk, there are now further reports that the Russians have almost completed the capture of Udachny, a village on the railway lines to the southwest of Kotlino, where all the recent fighting has been. Udachny will bring the Russians further west of Pokrovsk, putting them in an even stronger position to begin the encirclement of Pokrovsk from the west than they already are. So there it is. Negotiations between the Americans and the Russians underway in Riyadh. The Americans and the Russians did not set a date for the Putin-Trump summit. It's clear to me that the Americans came to Riyadh trying to get the Russians to agree a date. The Russians, as one might expect, given that they feel that they're in a position of advantage, seem to have delayed. Ushakov said that it was too soon to agree to that, though he still expected the meeting to take place fairly early. The Russians, skillful negotiators that they are, know how to play games of having the Americans ask for something and then keeping the Americans waiting. There will be a summit meeting between Lavrov and between Putin and Trump. It will happen in Riyadh. It might still happen next week, but now it seems more likely it will happen in March. But the process is moving. The embassies are being reopened. It's clear that the objective is full normalization of relations. Zelensky is clearly on his way out. The Americans and the Russians seem to be agreed about that. And all this nonsense from Europe, the talk about weapons and troop deployments and irreversible course of Ukraine towards NATO, all of that is just so much empty air. Well, this is where I finish today's program. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.